Hello, Greg Brail from Sonoa here again with Ryan Bagnulo. We're talking about all kinds of stuff, and we were just talking a second ago about personal identifiable information and some of the privacy and regulatory risks around data that might be stored in the cloud.
Right.
And of course, easy for me to ask the question, what do you do when you have to deal with that kind of data in a cloud environment or even just an internet environment in general?
Yeah, so while personal identifiable information is a challenge to deal with in a public environment where you're not necessarily confident about how trustworthy that environment is, which by the way, I'm of the opinion that no service provider is to be trusted. Not even your own employees.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take that premise, then you have to simply implement countermeasures, mitigations. And it's not insurmountable. So one of the first tactics that people typically implement is to de-identify the data.
Okay.
And this is very common in pharmaceutical industry for R&D purposes. Right, they'll collect data about a population for a typical or a certain type of illness, and then they'll start to do drug discovery on that population. But they want to make sure that that population's identity is obscured.
But of course, it still matters that they are individuals and you can identify them. You
Yes.
just don't want to know who. Yeah.
Right. So the extent to which you de-identify is subject to interpretation based on the auditor that you're dealing with. So in some cases, even including the age of the person is too much information. The initials is too much information. Definitely the name, social security number can't be included.
Absolutely not.
No. So can you put this data on the cloud? After you de-identify it, yes, you can. And then you can run your analytics on it and take advantage of the power of these distributed computing resources and leverage the vision of grid computing to do faster analytics on a large data set to find that insight you're looking for.
Now, what about monitoring and filtering the data as it goes in and out of the cloud?
That's another mitigation. So don't just use the cloud services or the platform as a service or the infrastructure as a service that you get from your cloud provider out of the box. Implement on top of those resources a tier of security on the edge. And everything going in and out of the cloud is then filtered. And by doing that filtering, you're able to do authentication, authorization, audit logging. You're able to maintain the confidentiality of the data by denying access to a resource or method or a web service that the user isn't authorized to access. Multiple users who have access to a system have different levels of authority in that system. Two different doctors, for example, accessing a healthcare cloud should only be able to see their own patients, not all the patients.
Of course.
And so you have to maintain the authorization policies to the data that you're granting access to. And mediation is a great way to do that.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned the auditing, I think is important. You were talking earlier about regulations and requirements about data breaches. And I don't know if there's a way that having a good audit trail can help with that.
Yeah, so I think any mediation solution like Sonoa ServiceNet is a great source for intrusion detection or identifying if a breach has occurred, identifying if a large amount of data has left your system to a destination that it shouldn't have gone to, either intentionally or maliciously or accidentally.
Right.
Sometimes this happens accidentally when a system fails and a web service generates an error code, and in the error code is personally identifiable information about the user. And so you have to make sure that the errors that are being returned are also filtered. And you strip any of that information and you only send back to the user a clean error message.
Right.
And so that's another value of putting a facade, a web services facade, in front of the actual functioning web service. So you can strip data that's coming from the web service out if it doesn't belong on the internet. And you could even transform it and rename it and do your own de-identification in real time.
Yeah, because when it comes to this kind of data, the first step is obviously to protect it. But the second step, as I think I understand it, is to make sure to have an audit trail so that in case it does escape, you have been notify the authorities.
Yeah, you have to be able to identify if the breach has occurred, and the Federal Trade Commission just announced, just I think last week, that by February of 2010, if over 500 people have been exposed, if their identity has been exposed, if their person identifiable information has been compromised in any way, that you have to issue a press release, as well as notifying the individual in writing. Right? So this is now a regulation you must comply with. It doesn't matter if you're doing cloud or if you're hosting your own data center, but especially if you're doing cloud, because the risk is higher of breach. And so being able to identify if the breach has occurred and when it occurred and who was impacted is extremely important from a regulatory perspective. So it's A, prevent the breach as best as possible through mediation, and B, if for some reason there was a breach, detect it and report on it.
Right.
So you can comply with the regulations.
Better than
around
you report on it
notification.
and wait for someone else to report on it for
Yeah,
you.
that's right, yeah.
Yes. So we're going to take a little break, and we're going to talk a little bit more in the next segment. Thanks.